was gonna title this video Animating and CACANi because I don't have Procreate Dreams, but I think the hype has died by now. Hey guys, it's Al! I've put out several videos to celebrate the 10th anniversary of my indie anime's creation, but you know what hasn't been made yet? In animation, of course. So let's fix that. This intro ended up being way longer than I thought it would be, so if you want to save time and just skip ahead to where I begin animating, you can click on this timestamp here. Now, technically I have 3 different animation softwares and apps for me to choose from, 2 of them being pre-baked in the Clip Studio Paint and Procreate, but today I'm going to be using a different program, and the one that made me want to create the Caged Underworld as a fanime in the first place, which is CACANi. If this is your first time hearing about it, CACANi is a 2D vector-based animation software, with its biggest selling point being that it automatically generates in-between frames for the keyframes you draw on through the power of interpolation technology! I've done a couple of very short and often sketchy animations before, mostly in Photoshop, and the first one I have on my channel actually was of a character from the Caged Underworld. Full disclosure, I'm completely untrained in animation, and I feel like drawing comics is way more in my wheelhouse when it comes to my preferred form of sequential storytelling. Plus, last time I attempted animation was back in 2018, so this is just my verbose way of saying that what you'll see in this video will be short and simple, just something to help me dip my toes in and get acquainted with this software that's still brand new to me. Now, for the purpose of this video, I was totally prepared to reread my original scripts for TCU's fanime episodes so I could animate a scene from this project that died on the vine. I have scripts for the first 2 episodes, as well as about 4 chapters of a prose fiction adaptation that I toyed around with for a time, and I didn't even touch those when I was going through my video where I described the story's entire plot. Just rereading my rough outline excerpts for the 2 seasons and 2 backstory movies made me lose enough HP as it was, and I didn't know if I could handle anything more than that. But I was willing to put my dignity on the line this time to make a video for you guys. Well, all that prepared to take a trip to Cringetown ended up being for nothing because as I continued ironing out this video idea, I had a realization. Most of this material I had already shared for this supernatural fanime was heavily focused on these ghost characters, but what about before these characters died? What if this animation featured the main couple Weltrum and Kleinon back in their past lives as Akifumi and Makoto? So that was my jumping off point for this video. These animations will be concept scenes for the movie showing our protagonist backstories, Aki Squared and Secret Triune. In Aki Squared's outline, I included a scene where Akifumi was studying at the planetarium, and that was the basis for this first animation, but Secret Triune wasn't quite so straightforward, which we'll talk about when we get to Makoto's part of the video. Unfortunately, because these 2 didn't meet until after they already became ghosts, choosing to animate their human forms locked me out of animating them being cute and romantic with each other, so maybe I didn't think these through after all. To make things easier on myself, I did very rough sketches in Clip Studio Paint of the poses I wanted each animation to have before importing them into my animation software. The decision partly motivated by my inability to turn on CACANi's brush tapering feature when I first opened the program. There's a handy-dandy 314-page long user manual you can easily find on their website that made starting this project feel a lot less intimidating. That's just good advice in general, huh? Always make sure you read the manual first before jumping into using a software you have no experience with at all. Again, I haven't animated in a super long time, and my workflow used to just consist of drawing the frames in my art program of choice and doing all the editing and timing in a separate video editing software, so I don't know all the ins and outs of what an animation software is supposed to have, let alone this one where there's a lot of unique features that you need to learn how to use properly. There are a plethora of tutorials available on their YouTube channel as well, but most of them are for the version 1.0 version of the program, so if you're like me and using the 2.1 version, then the interface will be different, so that's confusing. Anyway, my initial idea for Akifumi's animation was to have him in the planetarium that he often visits when he needs a relaxing place to study or to escape from stressful life situations, and then he would turn around when he heard a notification on his phone. This idea ended up changing drastically once I started working on it, so don't get too attached to it. When you open CACANi, your frame rate is set to 24 frames per second by default. Later on, I changed it to 15 frames per second, and it's really nice that CACANi allows you to adjust your project's frame rate without having to start it all over again. But right away, I hit a snag when I started fine-tuning these rough thumbnails, which is that CACANi doesn't support multi-touch features. You see, I use my iPad to draw on my PC as a display tablet alternative using an app called Easy Canvas, also known as Easy and Light because the other more proper name isn't really optimized for search results. So while this has allowed me to draw in Clip Studio Paint just fine, when I came to CACANi, I couldn't tap to undo or pinch to zoom on my screen, so I needed to keep my keyboard and mouse next to me while I worked, which was a little uncomfortable but not super inconvenient in my opinion, and before long I had memorized the keyboard shortcuts for panning and zooming. This is the part where I finally joined the chore box cult. At least CACANi held up better than my 1.1 copy of Paint Tool Sai. Yikes! This leads me to the experiences I had trying to adapt to CACANi's UI quirks, which I don't think are necessarily good or bad, just not anything I'm used to. For example, I was struggling trying to figure out how to change my brush size or opacity by layers, until I realized that they're controlled by these sliders which are shaped like black squares, and you have to click and drag them until you reach the desired setting. It took me way too long to find tools for selecting and transforming parts of your art or flipping your canvas. I had to look up whether or not it was possible to rotate the canvas, and I don't think there's even a liquefy tool, although that last one is understandable since the program is vector-based. Fortunately, you can change your keyboard shortcuts by clicking on File, Customize Shortcuts, and directly below it is the Shortcut Guide selection, which pulls up a window showing a very useful and easy-to-read diagram of all CACANi's default keyboard shortcuts. I wish I had more time to fully read the manual and do some practice animations before jumping into making this video, but since I am working under a time crunch, I had to learn everything on the spot, and I do mean everything. This is literally the very first thing I ever made in this program since I first bought it. No practice animations beforehand to get a feel for the software, and considering I had practically no meaningful experience making proper animations to begin with, this video has the potential to end in a fiery disaster. TLDR, please watch this video for entertainment purposes only, and not to learn how to use this program because I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't think I have as much to say about sketching his school uniform, other than I had my eyes glued to my phone screen looking up reference images for gakurons. I tend to add wrinkles pretty liberally to the clothes I draw, so for this animation I dialed things back a lot more to make things easier myself and hopefully make the end result look more authentic. Also, back when I was still actively drawing on Kifumi's human form, I intentionally made his school uniform look more baggy, just because he's very short. But I didn't want to complicate things further, so I had it be more fitted for this video. While having reference images for planetariums pulled up on my phone, I sketched in the chair that Akifumi would be sitting in so I could tell which parts of his animation would be cut off. And that's when I realized that my original idea of him turning around to check his phone notification wouldn't work out, since there was no place in the composition where his phone would be visible. Then I thought instead he could have his head turning away from the viewer, as if there's an event about to begin at the planetarium and he's taking his eyes off his homework to pay attention to his surroundings, but after I began sketching his face from behind, I felt like the movement I wanted to convey would be too complex for getting back into animation and testing out a new program for the first time. So I took the coward's way out and just had him tilt his head upwards in the same perspective. I really wanted to animate something more elaborate to show off what this program is capable of, and now I feel really bad for going with such a simple concept instead. At any rate, there's going to be two different areas of motion, one being Akifumi's handwriting on the page, and the other being Akifumi looking upward after the cycle for his hand, and so it won't be too plain, I guess. I know I've complained a lot about how embarrassing it's been for me to revisit some of my old materials for this fanime, and while Aki Square definitely has its share of dubious moments, I have more positive feelings about this movie than I do negative. The entire time I was plotting the outline for Aki Squared, it was the middle of autumn, I was looking forward to the holidays, the changing seasons, had me feeling more inspired, so I have a lot of cozy associations when I go back and read Aki Squared's outline. Now, there's a very important step you have to follow before you draw your next keyframe. Make sure you click on the navigator category in the side tray. It's not turned on by default, so click on the 4 arrows on the top right hand menu or press F2 on your keyboard. Detach the navigator window and make it as large as possible. You can zoom in on this view by pressing and holding Control Space while keeping your mouse clicked down and sliding it left and right. Once you create a blank keyframe, you'll notice an outline around one of the strokes of your previous keyframe and a row of arrows inside the shape. Recreate that same stroke in its corresponding area on the next keyframe, then once you're done, you'll find another stroke on your previous keyframe outlined in the same way. Recreate each keyframe in order and draw each stroke in the same direction the arrows are going in, because this is what allows the in-between frames to be properly generated. I didn't do this and just jump right into making my second keyframe because I didn't know any better, so when I generated my in-betweens, they look like this. I didn't know what I did wrong and briefly thought that maybe the lines weren't connected correctly, so on another drawing frame, I inked the rest of Akifumi's body and copied and pasted that line art onto the frames that I would be moving to see if that would fix the problem, but nope! I thought I had ruined my animation that I've been working on for the past 10 hours. It was on the verge of tears and even completely changing what this video would be altogether, but after looking for an outdated video tutorial in futile hope to find where I had gone wrong, which I still highly recommend watching because it explains more steps of the process than what I just described here, and asking for help within the official CACANi Discord server on where to find the reference frame mode on version 2.1 of the program, I got a surprisingly quick response that pointed me in the right direction, and I was off to the races. Started my second keyframe from scratch now that I knew the proper steps to take, and correcting my error without too much fuss. Now I forgot to hit record before I started any of this, but honestly I wasn't sure if it was necessary to show because I thought it might be boring to watch me go over my strokes again, so I'm not too mad about that. When I figured out what I needed to do to correctly prepare my next keyframe, I realized very quickly that the way I made my strokes for my first keyframe wasn't ideal. You're supposed to do every stroke in one continuous line, and I think that's why they made sure to include different variations of the curved line tool to make that easier. And if you just do your line art in short little strokes, then that's going to cause a lot of problems since you have to match every single one of those short little strokes in the next keyframe. Fortunately, this is very much in line with how I do line art by default, especially when I'm inking traditionally or drawing in Procreate, but I still have a habit of going back over my lines to add more weight, and that came back to bite me in the process of this animation. All things considered, it wasn't too bad. I mean, you saw what the tweens looked like before, but some parts of the generated frames did look kind of sloppy, and I suspect my amateur line job was the root cause of that. Fortunately, I did want to go back and tweak my in-between frames anyway, so cleaning up the line art wasn't too out of the way. Something I noticed with CACANi animation is that oftentimes the final result comes out looking too unnaturally fluid, and I actively wanted to avoid that. So what I did was delete a few frames that looked too similar to the ones immediately before and after it, and extend the duration of each remaining in-between frame to 2 frames instead of just 1, which helped me reach that Goldilocks zone of having the playback look smooth, but not so smooth that it made the timing look all floaty and weird. I also wanted to have Akifumi blinking to make the animation feel less static, and I was tempted to have the last frame be an overshoot and make the second to last frame the final one, but it looked weird so I had to skip that idea. Before I started the cleanup process, I was concerned that any changes I made to any generated in-between frame would automatically affect the ones around it, but fortunately that wasn't the case, so you can really go to town with fine-tuning your tweens if you want to. Well, within reason. If you go too off-model with your edits, things do start to get janky with the other frames, so be careful! Now that we're drawing Akifumi's hand, I can demonstrate how you're supposed to correctly draw your next keyframe for preparing your in-betweens. You can clearly see there's a small circle showing the start and end of each stroke you have to copy, so it's kind of like a game of connect the dots in a way. If you missed my steps the first time, don't worry, because you're going to be seeing me redraw this hand many times. Many times. I promise it's not that complicated because I was able to figure this out really quickly after I fixed my mistake with the head tilt keyframe earlier. I just figured out how to do something I didn't know before in this brand new program and get in the flow, but then when I had to do that thing again for another part of the process, I completely forgot what I had done before even though I did it so easily the first time. Do you guys have this problem too when you're trying out a software for the first time? One minute I thought I had this program figured out, and the next minute I'm like, why can't I remember how to do this thing that I already did? Somebody save me! Now, I know the title of this video says Animating in CACANi, so how mad would you be if I finished this project over in Clip Studio Paint? Okay, so CACANi does have a feature that allows you to automatically generate colors for your animation from a single frame, but coloring in this program is notoriously finicky, and I didn't have enough time to troubleshoot this feature in order to make it work for me. Plus, I wanted to do some compositing effects in Clip Studio Paint to begin with, so I might as well start bringing my frames into a program I'm much more familiar with to finish the job. Fortunately, exporting your animation as images from CACANi is very easy. You have the ability to either select the frame you're currently on, all the frames in your cell, or any frames you've selected beforehand, so transferring everything from CACANi to Clip Studio is a snap. There are other ways you can export your animation. Obviously, you could save it as a video, or even export your project directly to After Effects, so there's quite a few options at your disposal. So I did make a mistake when I was preparing my animation in Clip Studio. I made a new canvas directly out of my static frame of Akifumi's body, but I realized I needed to make a new animation file first and import my frames there, and once I did that, I noticed right away that my frames weren't in the correct size, or I guess position more accurately, so that was something I had to correct after I imported all my frames and added the base colors. So now I'm working on the colors, and it was at this point that all my regrets about stripping down this animation vanished instantly. It'd be one thing if I just kept it as line art for the sake of a practice piece, but I wanted to put a lot of effort into rendering this and overall having it look as close as to what you might see in an actual anime as I could get it with my current artistic ability. And by now I was anticipating having a lot of coloring layers to maintain, so I'm glad I ended up with something more simple, since otherwise I probably would have been too overwhelmed. This was actually my very first time making an animation directly within Clip Studio Paint's timeline, and it felt kind of awkward at first, but I was able to settle into things relatively quickly, so I have a lot of programs I need to get used to. As you can see, I'm pulling my colors for Akifumi directly from a page of the Forcoma spinoff, and it feels so surreal and almost uncanny in a way to be scrutinizing my old art that I meant to be representative of the quality of my work, because now it looks so wonky. Like, Akifumi's eyes in the reference are so small and they're barely visible against his bangs. His shoes came out so weird too. Like, when I was making this animation, I was searching for references for outdoor school shoes, like simple brown loafers, but in my old artwork it looks like I tried to draw tap shoes while having sleep paralysis. It really put into clear perspective just how much I've improved over the years, but for some weird reason when I was working on coloring these frames, it was almost like I temporarily forgot how to color things like I would now and default to the methods I used when I was a teenager. It happened at least twice during this process, and it's so bizarre. I have no idea what that was about. Putting this strange roadblock aside, the process of adding flat colors to these frames is straightforward enough, although the hand was a little problematic. First, I should have been more careful when separating the line art for the hand from the line art for the rest of his body, because I kept having to clean up the color of his skin that spilled over to the edge of his sleeve cuff. Also, because I played around with the timing and placement of a lot of these frames for this section of the animation, I had to make sure I wasn't unnecessarily coloring a frame I already added flats to earlier on, so I kept checking back and forth between CACANi and Clip Studio Paint to see which frame I was on, and if it was one I had duplicated before so I could just copy and paste my colors. By the time I was completely done with the flats, I regretted not adding more movement to other areas like his forearm, because just having only his hand in motion made the animation feel a little jittery and weird, and it's the part that stands out to me as the weakest part of this cycle, but it's a little late to change that now. With that out of the way, it's time to move on to shading and highlights. Now, technically I did these steps in reverse. I know that with anime you're supposed to plan out where the separation lines for your shadows and highlights will be while you're still doing your layout sketches. After I was done shading my first keyframe, I progressively started using more and more cheats to keep the rendering looking consistent, starting with copying and pasting my shadows and highlights and rotating them according to where Akifumi's head and hair was positioned so I wouldn't have to redraw them completely from scratch every time. I could just do a couple touch-up as needed. To prevent the outlines of my selections from getting blurry, I changed the interpolation method for the transform tool from bilinear to bicubic. For the hair highlights, I was going to be a good girl and hatch them in manually, but I just couldn't get them to come out right, so I did break out some manga hair highlight brushes that I downloaded from the CSP asset library to get the effect I wanted. In retrospect, I probably should have taken the time to do the highlights myself so they could have just the tiniest bit of wiggling from frame to frame to give the animation a true hand-drawn quality and make the movement a little less rigid. And I think the parts where you can see the highlights almost but not quite all the way being perfectly lined up with the new direction Akifumi's head is gradually being tilted and kind of exacerbates this, so that one's on me. I repeat the process one last time by rendering Akifumi's eye and adding shading to both his sclera and his hand, and with that, the animation itself is done. But hold your horses, there's still a lot we need to do, starting with filling in the rest of the background. So, about that chair. I was feeling really excited to put some techniques I learned about drawing with the lasso tool into practice, and I thought it would be the perfect way to render this sketch I did of the chair, since stationary items in anime are usually rendered in a really pretty lineless style, and this is how it turned out. See kids, this is why references are important, because honestly the backgrounds I drew for TCU's Forcoma when I was looking at reference pictures came out better than this. I don't necessarily hate how it turned out, it's just that it looks pretty sloppy compared to my original vision, so that kind of bums me out. I think I was able to save it by adding some textures and line art, but it still looks more like a paper craft someone printed out and scanned than something that's been designed by a professional animation staff. On top of that, doing coloring effects for the chair ended up being surprisingly difficult. I wanted to duplicate the chairs so they could be in a row and add color overlays to them to create more depth, but I had to tweak my layers a whole bunch to keep everything from looking too garish, and I hope it turned out okay in the end. I added a solid blue overlay over Akifumi to put him in place with the surroundings, and the best thing for me to do was crop the chair he was sitting on out from the overlays so it ended up less ugly. The rest of the planetary background was super simple, but oh my gosh, I absolutely love how it turned out. I'm obsessed! In my previous video, I mentioned how much I love drawing space backgrounds, so I'm probably gonna get a lot of side-eye for just stacking a bunch of space backgrounds from the Clip Studio Paint asset library and applying a bunch of different layer blending modes to them. I added some 2D camera effects so the starfield could paint on rotation to help the location feel more immersive. And for my final step, I really wanted to spring for some aesthetic post-processing effects, which I achieved through watching a tutorial on the Ibis Paint YouTube channel, and it seriously kicked the entire project up a notch. The steps are so simple, but they really make the final result look more like a real anime. So here's the completed animation! With Akifumi done, let's work on Makoto next, and as I alluded to before, I had a hard time coming up with an idea for what I wanted him to be doing. I didn't want anything he'd be doing in this animation to be too similar to Akifumi's, plus Makoto barely had any screen time in Secret Triumph before he died, and I didn't make it to those parts in my script, so I had to rely on my memory for what scene I could adapt. Really, my only option was to have him celebrating New Year's Day like he was doing at the start of the movie, since immediately afterwards was when he was blessed with suck. And after a lot of thinking, I finally decided to have him noshing on some Toshigoshi soba. I just wanted to be happy. He has no idea what's going to happen to him next in the story. Honestly, even when I was still in the coloring stage for my first animation, I was thinking of ways I could make Makoto's animation more complicated. Like, basic cheering animation is too boring, nobody's gonna want to watch that. What if he was eating, but his cat was sitting next to him flipping her tail? Or what if he was talking on the phone? Or standing outside on the balcony with his hair blowing in the wind? No, no, no! Say it with me. Keep it simple, stupid! I was really committed to having both Akifumi and Makoto in this video, but since I'm just getting back into the swing of the skill I didn't have much practice with to begin with, it'd probably be smarter to test something easy rather than wanting to make some cinematic masterpiece right off the bat. I'm not sure the simpler animation was the reason for this, or if I had just gotten more used to CACANi's interface by this point and was able to learn from my earlier mistakes, but I felt a lot more comfortable doing Makoto's animation, and I got him done in a fraction of the time it took for me to create Akifumi's, and even just drawing the line art for this second animation took me a little over an hour. Well, at least in the footage you're watching right now, because all the process being shown here ends up not being used for the final animation. So, after I completed all of the static parts of the animation, I was going to draw the first keyframe for the chewing animation, but then I realized I didn't like where Makoto's eyes and eyebrows were positioned on his face. So, I tried to nudge them down slightly, and CACANi froze and crashed on me, and it didn't save my file, and autosave wasn't on, so I lost all that work in an instant. Okay, don't panic! Because I recorded my screen, I took a cap of my final line art and traced directly over it so I wouldn't have to start completely from scratch by referencing my sketch a second time, which I did off screen. Man, I'm really glad I went with a simpler concept from Makoto's scene. At least I remembered to properly showcase the entire process for drawing your first and next keyframes and generating your in-betweens from start to finish, so that makes up for my dumb mistake. By the way, props to CACANi for having autosave switched on by default. I only went and turned it off because my computer is running out of space, but there are settings to change the interval by minute of when you want your progress to be autosaved, and whether or not you want to pause autosaving temporarily while drawing. It all feels really intuitive. I guess this leads me to one talking point I have for this video, which is whether or not I would recommend CACANi. That's complicated. In my heart of hearts, I want to say yes, but I feel like it would be irresponsible of me to do so. Whenever I talk about CACANi, I usually describe it as the animation industry's best kept secret, which I think highlights its greatest, but also worst aspects. Despite offering some great features, CACANi isn't nearly as ubiquitous as other animation programs, and I think that ended up doing them in. As of 2021, they've been radio silent across all of their social media, and we know that a 3.0 version is in the works, but we haven't heard anything about it, and the current version still has some unfixed bugs, which really makes me worry that this program is about to, or has already become abandonware, and it'll continue to be depreciated as new updates of Windows are released. Okay, maybe I'm catastrophizing a little because CACANi is used by animation studios, but the fact that the only time we've seen a public post from the company was when they announced a heads up that their website was undergoing maintenance, which was last year? And that's definitely concerning when you're thinking about the longevity of a program as expensive as this, especially if you're the kind of person who prefers monthly subscriptions over one-time payments, since CACANi gives you the option to choose between the two. The only other 2D animation software I know of that does anything like what CACANi offers is Cadmium, but that's still in beta. It only colors your frames rather than creating in-betweens, and unlike CACANi, which as I said before is interpolation based, Cadmium is powered by AI. I don't know exactly why CACANi and its community has been on life support these past few years, and I'm not going to pretend that I do, but it's really sad because this program has a lot of potential and it deserves more love. I'm still going to use it. After all, I bought it and I want to get my money's worth, dang it. And I have some faith that it'll be revived eventually, but it's up to you whether or not you want to vote with your money to help keep it alive, or if you think this is a sinking ship. Getting back to what I'm currently working on, as you can see, I finished the line art for Makoto's animation, so now I brought it to Clip Studio Paint to finish the job. The Joey animation is only 4 frames, but I think it looks deceptively smooth. I blocked all the lines in using green since that was what color his eyes were in his human form, but that ended up being pretty pointless since his eyes are closed anyway. Also, I liked how for Akifumi's animation there was a lot of ambient blue lighting, which wasn't intentionally a lampshade reference to his ghost form's main color, but coincidentally ended up that way, so I thought I'd keep the theme going by including some purple in Makoto's animation. I didn't want to have the ambient lighting be dark because I wanted to avoid having my two animations look too similar to each other, so I had to incorporate the purple in other ways. At first I was thinking of maybe having his hoodie be this color, but it felt wrong not having it be its usual dark red, so instead I added purple as a design element to the bowl he's holding. Right now his bowl is a solid color, but I added a purple decorative shape to just the top of it at another point in the process, and later on I chose a purple pattern to use as the fabric of his kotatsu. I didn't do a great job separating the layers for this animation. It was something I tried to do, but my animation wasn't the best because when I had to color Makoto's face, I had to be careful not to accidentally bleed into any of the line art for his hair that's meant to remain stationary. I tried my best to stay as close to the edges of the lines as possible, but the thing still ended up kind of wiggly in the final version, which honestly I kind of like. I think by having these imperfections it looks more like an authentic painted anime cell this way. Once again, for the background, I took the easy way out and just used CSP assets. I was trying to think of what kind of furniture would make sense for Makoto to have in his living room, and for some reason a plant just felt right. I could totally see him getting a plant just for the sake of giving his cat something safe to chew on, although I accidentally put most of it outside of the outmost border, so you could barely see it in the final animation. Sorry, I'm still getting used to how these frames work. A small part of me wonders if I tried too hard making this second animation look atmospheric, like since this is just a silly little chibi, it would have been perfectly acceptable to just make the background a quirky pattern without any lighting effects, but I just couldn't resist adding them. I even wanted to add some subtle 2D camera effects, but because I had to scale up my canvas, it made my art look jagged, so I skipped it. Once I play around with the same post-processing effects I used before, we're finally done! Here's the completed version of Makoto's animation as well as Akifumi's. Overall, I had fun with CACANi. I'm not used to it yet, but I could get used to it, and I'm definitely really inspired to practice animating more often. Thank you for joining me and listening to my incoherent ramblings as I try out this program for the first time, hopefully the first of many, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, bye!